Well, good morning. First of all, I'd like to say it's an honor and a little bit of a humbling experience to be here at this particular BMAF conference. I've been coming for this is my third year now, my first year speaking, of course, and I'm very excited about that. And like I say, there's some quite some honored and prestigious guests, both before and after me. So sometimes I wonder, how did I get myself up here? There was a pretty good introduction, so you might know a little bit about me or why I'm here. One more thing I'd like to say about the studies that we've done and kind of what brought me to this point is that my co-authors and I, visiting many sites in the Yucatan, in southern Mexico, in Guatemala, and in Honduras, we prepared for these sites by reading, doing a lot of study by the best non-LDS experts in the field of Mayan archaeology. And we're really excited to see what these places and see things we'd read about and see what kind of Book of Mormon connections we could find. And as we're planning for our trips and going around here, we thought someone needs to write what would be a guide for the LDS tourist on how to go to these places and what to look for and understand what you're seeing when you're there. We kept looking and looking, as it turned out no one had ever written that book, so eventually it kind of fell to us to write that. And so that has, through one point or another, led me here today. So what I was asked to speak about was a topic of metals and gold plates in Mesoamerica. So it's a fascinating topic, one that I think Brother Bushman certainly touched on in his previous one. I'd like to expound on a few of those things. But it's the first thing I'd like to say is that it's a tricky one, the one of metals in Mesoamerica. It's long been used by critics to show the Book of Mormon is anachronistic and is a modern invention. But I think that not only have perhaps the critics misunderstood the Book of Mormon and Book of Mormon events, I think perhaps we as members of the church might have misunderstood some Book of Mormon events as well. So we need to, I think, carefully study the Scripture to find out what it actually says, and perhaps most importantly, what it does not say about these topics. So the first question we want to ask here is, do the currently identified Book of Mormon lands, and here with the BMAF, we're settled on Mesoamerica, do they contain the necessary deposits of ore to support the kinds of metal mentioned in the Book of Mormon? The answer to that is yes. And I'm hoping that all right, looks like technical problems have been all figured out. This is a mineralogical survey map of Guatemala. And the kinds of metals we need to look for are gold, of course, silver, copper, iron, zinc, and tin. And that should pretty much help us to find the things mentioned in the Book of Mormon. And we find here, and I guess this I'll try and direct your attention to this. If we look at the highlands of Guatemala, which are going to be right in this area, we've kind of rested on that as being perhaps somewhere in there the land of Nephi. And if we look at concentrations of iron, we see that's where the iron is in the areas of the highlands of Guatemala, Mexico. We also see copper and then a good bit of gold around here. So we do have the necessary ores. So that's the first question out of the way. Let's see what else we have. There we go. So here we have Mexico. Similar kind of thing. We see concentrations from the modern-day mining in Mexico. We see silver in some areas down here, but not really seeing much iron at all. And the iron starts about here. There's some Fe, and we have some iron more around here, but not much really appears to be in this area right here. So we'll keep that in mind for a moment and come back to that. Now, we recognize this figure, right? There's good old Captain Moroni. Now, I think too often critics have attacked these images of the Book of Mormon, and it's easy to do. It's easy to attack that and punch holes in it. The trap we need to avoid as members is trying to defend these images instead of the Book of Mormon itself. We need to be guided by the Book of Mormon's actual text and not Arnold Freeberg's illustrations. we don't need to imagine Nephite soldiers dressed as Roman legion members or as Greek hoplites. Okay, this is Diego de Landa. I'm going to use him as a source material for some things. You may know him. He wrote a book in Spanish called Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán. It's known in English as Yucatan Before and After the Conquest. He was the bishop of the Yucatan in the 16th century. And we all know him for the one that burned every Mayan book he could find, as well as destroying almost all iconography and anything else he could get there. But his actions became so severe, he was called back to Spain to account for them, and he wrote a book that was not really found and discovered until much later, but it gave us some great accounts of the culture and history that he saw at his time. And so he kind of is both the destroyer of the Mayan culture and the recorder of it to some degree. But so I'm going to pull some source material from him. There we go. Here's a little figurine which is in the Popol Vuh Museum in Guatemala City. It's post-classic, but it's a warrior here. And let's take a look and see how he is dressed. And I'm going to read a quote from the Book of Mormon, if I can see it, that is, that Moroni had prepared his armies with, we got the breastplates and arm shields and head plates, but he also says, and they were dressed with thick clothing. All right, and we see definitely that's what this guy is wearing right here. From Diego de Landa's book, he talks about the Mayan warriors, that they had these jackets, double quilted jackets, these cotton jackets, that were very thick and were a big defense against the blows of weapons. In fact, in many ways, much more effective and better for the environment than the Spanish metal armor. And so that's his description right there about the thick clothing worn. So it's interesting how that coincides with how Captain Moroni dressed his armies with thick clothing. I've got an image here. This is lintel 16 from Yaxchilan. We see Bird Jaguar 4 dressed for war over a captive, and he's actually wearing right here this same thick kind of jacket. And this would be from the Mayan Classic period, but we see that type of thing over and over. So it looks like the Nephite accounts of their clothing were correct from what we see archaeologically. Now their breastplates and other items may have been of metal, but we're not really sure. The most important part seems to have been the thick clothing. And we see that the Spanish agree with that, and also the Mayan archaeology does as well. Okay, recognize these people, right? Back to King Noah and Benadai. I'm going to deal with the topic of metals just with Nephite history because we have the most information from the Nephites. Know very little from the Lamanite point of view and only a tiny, tiny bit from the Jaredite point of view. So just talking about Nephite history, Nephi tells his people in 2nd Nephi, I did teach my people to build buildings and to work all manner of wood and of iron and of copper and of brass and steel and of silver and precious ores which are in great abundance. So it seems like that this ability came from Nephi. He's the one that built the tools to build the boat. He's the one that made the plates, and perhaps he's the one that had this ability and it shared through him. So keep that in memory for a minute. Now, of course, the two things that are really problematic are the iron and the steel in Mesoamerica. What I find is interesting is that the very last mention of steel in the Book of Mormon occurs about 400 BC, and that's it. And that's in the Book of Jerem, that says that the Nephites multiplied exceedingly and became very good in the workmanship of wood, buildings, machinery, interesting, also iron, copper, and brass and steel. That's the last mention of Nephite steel, and that's 400 BC. Now, the last mention of iron in the Book of Mormon is about 150 BC, and that's with this situation right here. We know that in Mosiah 11, King Noah laid a tax of 1/5 of all that his people possessed, 1/5 part of their gold and of their silver, and 1/5 part of their ziph. I'm not quite sure what that is. There have been some interesting work and scholarship on what that could be, and of their copper and their brass and their iron. All right, so that's the last mention right there. We also read that he had many elegant buildings, and he decorated them with precious things, including gold, silver, and iron, and brass, and ziph, and copper. So metals are always mentioned as being precious. I think that topic was brought up by Brother Bushman as well. So in this case, iron appears to have been decorative in nature and also very precious. So again, that's the last time we're going to hear of Nephite iron is in about 150 BC. And all these times that iron or steel are mentioned among the Nephites are when they were presumably in the Guatemalan highlands. And it's not mentioned other places. So we know that King Noah taxes people 1/5, and whenever the Lamanites conquered them and took over, they took over, and that would be his son Limhi, they taxed the Nephites 1/2 of everything they had. And in Mosiah 19, the Book of Mormon says, the Lamanites had spared their lives, took them captives, and carried them back to the land of Nephi, and granted unto them that they might possess the land under the conditions they would deliver up King Noah into the hands of the Lamanites, and deliver up their property, even 1/2 of all they possessed, 1/2 their gold, their silver, and all their precious things. It doesn't mention iron specifically there, so we're not sure if the Lamanites really had a use for iron. So taking my mineralogical maps and kind of superimposing them onto a map of Mesoamerica, the only times that Nephite steel or iron are mentioned are when they're living in what we believe would be the Guatemalan highlands, and that's where we find deposits of iron ore. And iron is, of course, necessary to make steel. If they went from up in the land of Nephi and went down to Zarahemla and other places, we're getting an area where there's kind of a lack of that sort of ore. And so perhaps they only used it when their source was there. When they moved down to other areas and up farther north, we're not really getting much iron until we get farther into Mexico. And so perhaps if a lot of the Book of Mormon events are taking place around here, the Nephites could have been adapting to the local materials if there was not much metal around. So how long did Nephites use metal, and how widespread was its production? The Book of Mormon really doesn't contain this kind of information. So any attempt to answer that would just be a guess. We know that Lehi's group arrived with metal implements, and they had a knowledge, at least through Nephi, of how to make them. But that really seemed to be kind of his skill that he kept and passed down. It's likely the Lamanites didn't really have that ability. Laman and Lemuel don't strike me as the kind of people that would spend a lot of time trying to make metal weapons. So if the Nephites had this ability of metallurgy, it's likely they would not really share that technology with any surrounding culture, be it friend or foe. So if we try to reconcile the Book of Mormon accounts of metallurgy with what we know from Mesoamerican archaeology, we're going to probably have to say that this metalworking was going to be an old world skill that Nephi brought with him. And it was not shared with indigenous American cultures, which were certainly already there. If the Nephites stopped using metal for tools, weapons, or decoration, then what was the reason? Again, look at where the metal was and look at where they probably ended up. So it could have been the lack of available ore. So one thing, of course, we read about in the Book of Mormon all the time is swords. Recognize that guy, don't we? Get ready to chop off some arms. So, would these swords have been as Arnold Freeberg imagined them? Wouldn't they have been steel or iron or something like that? Well, let's take a look here. When I was in the Yucatan Peninsula in the region called the Puc, I went down to the Loltun caves. And as you go down, the guides have to lead you there. He pointed to a spot on the wall and said, "There's the Loltun Warrior." And I looked and I snapped a picture, and that's what I got. But I couldn't really see anything. I wondered how he knew it was there. Later, there was a really great article written about swords and scimitars in a Book of Mormon Studies journal, and I was able to get a drawing of this. And there, we can sort of see it. This is this drawing of the Loltun Warrior was done by people who came from the area of Camino Huyu, which is the highlands of Guatemala, and it was done in pre-classic times. So we see a guy right here, and he's holding, it kind of appears a bit dark in this, but he's holding a weapon right here, a long weapon with sharp blades on the end, and a curved kind of thing right there, curved there and curved there. And the Book of Mormon mentions swords and scimitars, which are generally thought to be scimitars. This has been one bit of criticism against it because a scimitar is believed to be an Islamic or an Arabian sword from the post-Christian era. So the question is, how would anyone have known about curved swords in the Book of Mormon times? We have here, this is Stela 11 from Kaminohuyu, which shows a very similar kind of guy, similar style, and he's holding what appears to be the same type of item or weapon. And there's the hand there, and there's the curve of one blade going there and a curve going another. So there's an interesting article about this perhaps could be an idea of a Book of Mormon scimitar or scimitar that I came across. But I have an actual obsidian example of that right there to see that there were things they could make. We probably know about obsidian and the sharp edge that it could hold. There we go. So here are some examples of curved swords from the Old World. On the top we have what's called a falcata. This is the 4th century BC. It's from the Iberian Peninsula. And the idea of a curved sword that gives the weight towards the tip right there. And so it has kind of the power of an axe, but the cutting power of a sword. So it's a kind of a nice combination there. The bottom one is a Middle Assyrian bronze sickle sword from 1307 to 1275 BC. So definitely in the area that the Lehi and his family came from, the knowledge was had of the effectiveness of curved swords. I also have at the top an Egyptian sickle sword. This is at least 300 BC to perhaps 2000 BC. That's an actual example on the top. The other ones are modern reproductions, and the cutting edge would be right there. So we do have the idea that they could have come with the idea of how to make weapons and how to make curved swords as well. That's certainly not anachronistic to the time period they came from. So let's look and see what I find interesting. This is an item that I have here, which I decided not to try and bring on the plane with me. Don't know what they would say. But we're familiar with the Aztecs called it a macuahuitl, and the Maya called it a hadzab. Most archaeologists call it an obsidian-bladed club. I find it interesting that there seems to be a reluctance to call these items swords when the Spanish, who had to fight against them, called them espadas, or swords, even referring to some warriors as having two-handed broadswords. This is a modern recreation that I have, made of wood here with obsidian blades along the edge. Mine has a bit of artistic license taken with this very sharp-pointed tip right there. But I find it interesting that Loltun Warrior, the carving that was done from Kaminohuyu, his item he was holding up had a tip on the end as well, very sharp-pointed tip. And we have an example here from an illustrated Spanish manuscript of local Aztecs. Look what they're doing, hacking off limbs. So this was a very effective item here. And of course we read about Ammon, that he was able to hack off some limbs with his sword. And then of course the odd thing is that the Lamanites that were with him took the arms and took them to the king and said, look, here's what he did. I've always thought this was a little strange thing to do. Here's a bunch of arms. But Diego de Landa, in his account, talks about a battle in which, I guess I should have some glasses here, there were 17 Spaniards, and it was 40 servants killed, and then the locals took their arms and feet and sent them throughout the lands as a token of what they had done. So, not the first time that's happened, I imagine. And just to see, what this type of thing can actually do, we've got, here are some Spanish drawings of it, as well as some actual examples, there and there, the ancient ones. And there we go. I've got a little clip here. This is from one of my favorite shows. It's not on currently, but it's called Digging for the Truth. Fascinating show, and we have here the host Josh Bernstein finding out how effective one of these obsidian-bladed swords could be. So if you could run that video there.
Here we go. More effective. Switching sides.
No wonder some of the Aztecs' opponents chose surrender over war.
In there. Yeah, I can hear. That's the bone.
All right, and so that's him picking it up for the first time. Some Spanish accounts say that a skilled Aztec warrior could practically hack off the head of a horse in one blow with one of these. So we know that swords don't have to be metal to be deadly and effective. So even though we're kind of getting away from the idea of the need for metal in the Book of Mormon times in order for things to happen, most Mesoamerican collections in museums will have a small collection of metal items. Things like mainly bronze and copper. There's a good bit of that. Well, where did those things come from? Here's a place many of you should recognize. This is the Cenote at Chichen, Itza. And we have a lot of great artifacts from this site because of a guy named Edward Herbert Thompson. And so what he did, and there we have some photos there. In the early 20th century, he actually read the accounts of from the Spanish chroniclers that the Maya had thrown sacrifices and items and offerings down into the cenote. And no one really believed that, but he did, so he tried to dredge the cenote, and there is some of his equipment there. And it didn't really work because we all know cenotes are really underground rivers under the Yucatan, so it just kept coming back in. So he eventually put on his diving suit and went down the water himself, and for years was just excavating the cenote and sending all the items he found back to the Peabody Museum in Harvard, which was funding his stay there. So after a number of years, the Mexican government found out he was doing this, charged him with taking items illegally, confiscated his plantation, which he had bought, which was at Chichen Itza, and he escaped the country and went back to the U.S. But because of his efforts, the Peabody has what I've seen probably some of the best collection of Mesoamerican artifacts anywhere. And I have here, a couple of years ago, one of my co-authors and I were able to arrange a research visit to visit the Peabody's archives, and saw some fascinating things that are in there, but they're not on display to the general public. Here we have some axe heads of copper alloy, but basically bronze, that they have. And we read that's, of course, one of the things that Nephi taught his people about how to make. These are fairly late as far as Mayan culture, so they're kind of late classic and some post-classic. We had also Diego de Landa, from his account, said that they had hatchets of a certain form of metal that they used in times of war as weapons and also for tools to cut wood and so forth. So we have some agreement happening there. And the Peabody's archives are also various other items, copper, tools and blades, even this very giant, pretty hefty spearhead I was surprised at how big and heavy that was. And of course we read about spears in the Book of Mormon armies as well. So these are some of the artifacts that were found in the cenote at Chichen Itza. Now, so we have that. When we talk about iron, there's been a lack of reluctance to really expect anything with iron from ancient Americas. There's been some thought that some of the ancient peoples might have found meteoric iron and pounded it and just cold worked it to do some things. But in the Peabody's own archives, I've got a page here from one of them, shows that there were pre-Columbian iron items found. So this is a page from 1883 in Costa Rica. These items down here highlighted say an iron chisel, blade of an iron tool, and an iron tool. Found in a pre-Columbian site. We have the description of it right here near a river in Costa Rica. And these are the iron tools right there. So that definitely, to me, is iron. That looks like there's a good degree of metalworking happening there. And that's definitely pre-Columbian iron. Also, right here we have some needles. These are iron needles from Mexico found in 1897 in what was thought to be a burial cave in the state of Guerrero. So what we have now is these probably aren't dating back to Book of Mormon times. We do have pre-Columbian iron that is not controversial at all. These are items that are sitting in the archives of the museum and aren't out on display to the general public. So we're getting, as we look closer into this, we're seeing more and more examples of the types of metals we need to find. There we go. One thing I'd like to mention is that the idea of ancient American metallurgy is one that has not received a whole lot of attention as much as it deserves. There's a woman named Dorothy Hostler, who's a professor of archaeology and ancient technology at MIT. She worked at excavations at a site called El Manchon, also in the state of Guerrero, Mexico. And these are some photographs here from that. These are copper smelting furnaces. So in her report in 2003, she said that the purpose of the work there was to address significant gaps in the understanding of metallurgy in Mesoamerica. And until her work, there had been little evidence of pre-Columbian metal smelting in that area or anywhere. But this is one site, and there are others that have really been untouched. So it's almost unknown archaeologically, and there's a lot more work that has to be done in this area. The approximate dating of this site is about 1300 AD, but the people who live there, there's no connection between them and other known cultures. So the ethnic background of the people that lived at that site, El Manchon, is really unknown. It's also not known where the copper ore came from or where the ingots they smelted ended up. But we can see that, when we talk about ancient Mesoamerican metallurgy, there's just a big, huge gap in our understanding that is just now really beginning to be addressed. So if we think about Nephite metalworking and say it probably really all traced back to Nephi, then if we look at the Middle East of the 7th century BC, we want to ask, are these descriptions plausible of those types of metal weapons? We read, of course, about his bow of steel and Laban's sword of steel. Did that exist in the Middle East so long ago? The answer is yes. We don't really know where Laban's steel sword came from or Nephi's steel bow, but we do know that they were apparently rare and costly at the time. So it's well known that part of the world was well within the Iron Age, but there is steel that is found as well. I have some examples here from the Mediterranean area. At the bottom, right here, that's a quench-hardened steel knife found from a tomb at Idalion in Cyprus. It was found in 1971, and it dates to the 11th century BC. At the top is a miner's pick found in a 1976 excavation from Mount Adir in northern Galilee. And so it's a steel pick, and it dates to the 12th or 13th century BC. So very ancient examples of steel. It may have been, rare and costly, but Nephi's items of steel are certainly possible in that time period, and they're not anachronistic at all. So if we're going to look at an old world tradition or origin for Nephite metalworking, what about Mesoamerican metalworking and metallurgy? What do we know about that? The earliest items of gold from the Mayan era were found at the base of Stela H in Copan. So that's Stela H right there. Many of these stelae had a cache buried underneath them when they were dedicated, and the gold there dates to about 730 AD, and it actually came from Panama or Colombia. So it appears that for the Maya and other cultures in the area like the Olmec, it took them a while to discover either the usefulness of metals or the value of metals. So the question we want to ask is, what was the most precious substance to the Maya or the Olmec? And it was anciently jade. And mainly because of its color, green. To the Maya, green symbolized pools of water and growing maize, and they were all feminine creative forces. We see here some examples of jade from the Peabody collection. This one right here actually has hieroglyphs inscribed upon it, and that's even from their description as well. So another little fragment of jade that I found in my time looking at their archives with Mayan hieroglyphs. This one actually has a hieroglyph that reads right here, E-U-T, which means, and then it came to pass. And this actually is a very common Mayan phrase. And during our trips to sites especially in Chiapas and in Guatemala and in Copan, we found just countless examples of this glyph on all kinds of items, mainly carved in stone, Here's an example of it carved in jade, which was the most precious substance to the Maya at the time. Now, at some point, gold, which symbolized masculine forces like the sun, began to kind of take over and replace jade as an item of value. We're not quite sure when this happened or how, but between 400 and 700 AD in Costa Rica, that's when that began to happen there, and then it began to work its way northward into the Mayan era. So we're not quite sure how the transition from jade to gold took place, but South America does have a very ancient example of metalworking. And so I've got here some items from the Moche culture. The Moche culture is from Peru, which actually predates the Inca, and they did quite a bit of metalworking there. We've got an example of a soldier buried with a lot of metal items, weapons, and armor right here. And here's something that's actually quite recent. I came across this in a National Geographic. This was a couple of years ago. There was a mummy found from the Moche culture in Peru, buried around 450 AD. And the mummy was actually a female mummy, buried with all kinds of metal items and items of great importance, but she was wrapped up in all these plates all around the burial shroud. And the plates are being described as a copper-gold alloy. I've got another example right there of that mummy with the copper-gold alloy plates. Now we know that the Spanish came across a copper-gold alloy they called tumbaga. That's been mentioned here earlier, and that was their name for it. This appears to be the earliest find so far of this type of metal, copper-gold. 450 AD, that's getting back pretty far. So one question here is that if this is happening in Peru and Bolivia, and it gradually spread northward, how did it take so long to get up to Central America and Mesoamerica among cultures we know like the Maya or Aztec or so forth? That question is still unanswered, but one idea is that the decline of many Mayan centers and the fall of Teotihuacan may have had an impact because they were having trade routes going from north to south, and when that disappeared, trade routes from south to north may have been able to open up and come in. This time period is right around the time of the destruction of the Nephite civilization. So we're talking about 350 AD or so forth, and maybe that could have had an impact as well. So if you take all these factors together, it could have been the driving force that opened up trade routes to areas that are now Bolivia and Peru, and that could have been how metal was introduced to Mesoamerica. So if the Nephites did not share their metalworking technology, later Mesoamerican metallurgy appears to owe more to South American influences than to any group mentioned in the Book of Mormon. So this is kind of what the archaeological record would support at this time. And even though gold was highly valued among later peoples, Aztec and later Maya and all that, its value appeared to be more symbolic. So known ancient cultures did not equate it with wealth, as we know the Nephites did for a long time, and apparently the Lamanites at least sometimes. That appears to be an old world concept, so something that they kept with them that didn't really catch on here. There's our female Moche mummy there. That was found or excavated in May of 2006, and 450 AD. So you might be wondering, I've wondered this, what's the oldest metal item found in the Americas? And that is right here. We've got a gold necklace found in the region of Titicaca, and it dates to 2000 BC. So 4,000 years ago, it goes back that far. What's interesting about this, I think, is if we look at the Nephites, very early on, we read in Jacob, that they were searching after costly clothing, and some of them began to wear gold and to be lifted up in the pride, and kind of look down upon others with gold. And you think, well, they haven't been here very long. They should be more concerned with, crops and hunting and building communities and keeping together. Yet some people thought finding gold and wearing it would be more important. What's interesting is that the archaeologists who found this said it was actually surprising that people this long ago would be wearing gold, and it seems to show some type of social inequality, that people would wear this to say, look at me, I'm someone important, when, obviously there's not really any point to it at all. So we find these same attitudes that we find in the Book of Mormon that Nephites fell into, people have been doing, for a long time. Now, plates of gold. Hoping to wake some of you up back there. That's what we came to see, right? How about this plates of gold thing? Now, if we look at examples of writing on plates and other precious metals, really what we have are old world examples. And I want to talk about that. Let's see just what we find from the old world. There we go. This was found in 2006. And let's look at a couple of the common denominators as we go through this. Found in 2006 in a child's grave in Haupthorn, Austria. This is a gold-plated 3rd century AD scroll, tiny scroll. Now it's written in Greek, right? My Greek is not so good, but it does read, I'll outline these for you. Summa Israel Adone Elohe Adon That's not Greek, that's Hebrew. It's a Greek transliteration of a Hebrew prayer. And that's actually found in Deuteronomy 6:4. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." So we have Greek-speaking Jews wanting to write down a Hebrew prayer, but using it in a language that they could read. If they couldn't read the Hebrew, they wanted to be able to say it in Hebrew. Think about that with some of the things that Brother Bushman said about the idea of writing the gold plates in Hebrew, but with Egyptian characters. We know now this is something that the people of Hebrew origin did. I've got these items here, which if you've been to the Harold B. Lee Museum or Library, at BYU, you might have seen. These are bronze plates. They're from 109 AD, and they're an alloy of copper, tin, and lead. This, of course, these are fragments of the copper scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in 1952, written between 500 and 100 AD. It's copper with about 1% of tin, and these are, of course, found at Qumran. This is the Taxila copper plate from Pakistan, written either from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. These are called the Pyrgi plates. They were found in 1964 at an Etruscan town. It's now Santa Severa near Rome. These are written about 500 BC. And of course, any good LDS person should know about the gold plates of King Darius. These were found in 1933 at Persepolis in Persia. They were written about 522 BC. There are gold versions. There are silver ones as well that were buried with them. And we also know they were buried in a stone box. Now here's something interesting. Brother Bushman did mention this. This is the oldest book with pages known. This was found in the 1940s in the valley of the Struma River in Bulgaria. It's an Etruscan book. It was at least dates back to 500 BC, and it's 6 pages bound of 24 karat gold. So I find it interesting that the oldest known book with pages is made of gold. So you perhaps forgive me, I'm an artist by profession, and I'm a very visual person. So when I hear about something, I like to see it, and there we go. Something which I came across very recently, this is the oldest biblical passage known. These are 2 tiny silver scrolls found in 1979 in the Hinnom Valley, and that's in Jerusalem. They date to 600 to 700 BC, and they contain a priestly blessing from Numbers 6. What we have here actually written on them, we've got a photograph of one here, a photograph of another one, and then a drawing. This is Paleo-Hebrew. So it's the Hebrew written with characters that are older than they're written with Phoenician characters, older than the Hebrew that is known today. So it appears that Laban's gold plates would have probably been written in this Paleo-Hebrew. Now let's look at a couple of common denominators from these ideas of these metal and gold plates and writings. One is all from the Old World. So we have the Mediterranean, Southern Europe, and the Middle East. Another thing is, none of them, as far as I know, was known in Joseph Smith's time. All discovered, in the past century or even more recently. So his idea of, the gold plates or the gold Bibles, people began to call it, it's interesting because I think most critics look at that and, that's the easiest thing to cast doubt on and to throw out. But it seems that in Joseph Smith's time, everyone believed he had them. His friends and his enemies all believed he had something. So what was it? How did he make up the idea of plates written on metal when there were really no examples anyone would have known? And so this is what we have now. I find interesting, the oldest biblical passage we have was written on metal, and so many other very important documents written on metal. Joseph Smith never could have imagined that these items really existed. He just had to go with what he knew and what he saw. So let's move this now to Mesoamerica, because that's what we're here to talk about, right? Gold in Mesoamerica. Now, back to the Cenote there, and Edward Herbert Thompson. So between 1904 and 1910, he's at his work, and he's dredging the Cenote. And one very interesting group of items he comes up with are gold fragments and plates and discs that were at the bottom of the well. And of course, these were the cenotes to the Maya were seen as being openings to the underworld. They looked at the underworld, the realm after death, as being below the ground in this watery era, and so the underworld gods kind of dwelt there. And these cenotes, which the limestone collapsed and fell and exposed them, they felt those were portals to the underworld, and they would offer human sacrifices and even items to the people there by throwing them down into the cenote. Diego de Landa even records that the Maya believed that the sacrifices, the people that they threw down there, would return alive after 3 days in the underworld. So that's a Mayan belief of his time. So here are some of the gold fragments that were recovered from Thompson's efforts. We've got some small items there of gold. Here's an item that I was able to take a look at and hold at the archives at the Peabody. And I found it interesting talking about how thin the metal would have been. How thin were the plates? How heavy were they? Most of these items here are labeled as gold or gold alloy or just metal. They're not very descriptive. And this is one here that is extremely thin, but it's also very stiff. And I was reminded of Joseph's accounts of the plates had the appearance of gold and not quite so thick as common tin. So this is some of the gold that's been found in the cenote at Chichen Itza. Now, there's no ore in the Yucatan Peninsula. There's no gold there. So they were brought from somewhere else. It's they date to the 9th century A.D., and the idea is that they came from as far away as Colombia, Guatemala, or Oaxaca. And there's also thought they were brought perhaps blank to the area of Chichen and then engraved and decorated there. Many of these plates have images and other items on them. Now, you'll hopefully forgive me if I like to call them plates. Many of the archaeologists call some of the round items just discs or fragments. But many of them show, there we go, they show Toltec warriors. Toltec warriors coming from northern Mexico. And these warriors and this introduction from the Toltecs into the Maya era of Chichen Itza is depicted here. This is the lower temple of the jaguar at Chichen Itza on the other side of the ball court. But I've got, hopefully you can see there, I've got some of the murals outlined that are still there. And inside, if you're able to walk through and look at these and see what the murals were inside, the murals show Toltec warriors coming in, and some of them are wearing, you can see the areas I've highlighted with little gold here, some of them are wearing these gold discs. And that was a symbol they brought with them. To the Toltecs, these gold discs symbolized authority, they symbolized power, they also symbolized revelation. and a portal or a connection between them and the next world. That was what it meant to them. And I've got a really close-up detail of one of the guys there who's wearing these gold discs or plates. So again, the gold examples we were able to see were extremely thin, but still seemed to be quite stiff and very substantial. So let's take a look at those. There we go. Here's one that has been kind of reassembled and put together and mounted in the archives. Now what's fascinating about this is I've read about these from time to time, but I've seen very little in the way of photos. People talk about these, but there really aren't any photos of them. So these are some of the photos we took in the archives, and we had to sign some very strict forms with the Peabody not to use them for any commercial purposes. But here they are. Now remember, these are in their archives. They're not on display to the general public. When I asked the curator about that, she said that, well, they're making an exhibit takes a lot of time and money. They don't have the money for it all. They don't have the space. They've basically been sitting in the archives for about 100 years. And from what I can see, there's not a whole lot of archaeological work being done on them. There's not a whole lot of study. There was a guy named Samuel Lothrop that did drawings of them and published a book on them, and that was earlier in the 20th century. But apart from that, there seems to be not a whole lot of effort being gone into them right now. So anyway, these discs here, because reminded of Nephi teaching his people that to work in gold and to work in all manner of things and to create items of metal. Here's another one. Again, these were symbols of authority and represented portals into the next world. So the murals that show these that I showed you have actually been completely worn away. They're in the lower temple of the Jaguar at Chichen and also the upper temple of the Jaguar, which overlooks the ball court. And you can't go into any of these currently, but in the 1800s, an English artist named Adela Barton drew extensive copies of them, and so that's where I'm getting my drawings of them. So she was able to preserve those murals. By the way, the murals in the upper temple of the Jaguar contain massive scenes of battle, just hundreds and hundreds, perhaps even more, of soldiers in huge scenes of battle fighting around towns, which goes against what was thought for much of the 20th century about the Maya and their history. So in addition to some of these items here, these discs here, these gold discs, there are at least 29 of these round plates or discs that were found by Thompson. Some of them are in fragments, some of them are whole. They're labeled rather vaguely in the archives. The curator said they date to 1910, so those would be the ones that Thompson found. If you look at the, at least I believe currently they would still be there, at the main Archaeological Museum in Mexico City, they have some other examples of these gold discs and plates, but they weren't removed from Mexico at the time. So in about 1961 and 1967, divers found additional gold items, and those would be the ones you would see in Mexico City. So let's take a close look at this plate right here. Around the edges, we're going to look right around here on these borders here and down here, Mayan hieroglyphs. So we have Mayan hieroglyphs on plates of gold. Now these definitely post-date Book of Mormon time periods. However, how many people just laugh at the idea of plates of gold with writing on them from the Americas? Well, they've been sitting in the Peabody Museum for about 100 years, and they're non-controversial at all. Every now and then, I think, as members of the church, we hear stories about ancient gold records, kept by, or knowledge kept by the local shamans, and secret records and things like that. But it's not taken seriously by mainstream archaeology. These are things that are completely non-controversial, and there's no doubt about them. I was also reminded how it was mentioned earlier by Brother Bushman that the Nephites said it was actually quite difficult to engrave their writings upon gold. Here's another section of that same gold plate with Mayan hieroglyphs right along there. This next one here is perhaps the best example that we found. It has some drawings, or not drawings, but engravings right here. Many of them show bearded Toltec warriors, oftentimes engaging in human sacrifice. And around the edges here are other Mayan hieroglyphs around the edge. We'll zoom in a bit. And Diane Worth suggested to me that this could represent a celestial band. And some of these glyphs she sees as being similar to Mayan glyphs that refer to the moon and the center of the sky. So that's something that I think is actually quite interesting. We were excited to be able to see and to hold these plates and wondered why the people aren't talking about them more. Again, there's no direct connection with the Book of Mormon, but did people somehow get the idea that you could use gold as a medium to, to write on and to have some kind of sacred offering to the gods or something that would be very special. So let's compare that with the Nephite record keepers. One thing I find interesting is that we have about 22 Nephite record keepers that I've been able to come across in the Book of Mormon, from the original Nephi on down. We have 22 of those, and of those, the majority of them have names that are Semitic names or ones that you can't render in Mayan languages. And so what I've wondered about that is that perhaps the Nephite record keepers had a special relationship with a special task, that they kept alive the languages they brought with them, like the Reformed Egyptian that's mentioned, like Hebrew, and they wrote in that because it was a special record. And they also kept alive this tradition of metalworking that they brought with them. It's possible that the original Nephi got the idea of making metal plates to keep his record and pass on from the brass plates that Laban had because they were so special. So the current scholarly consensus is that no known Mesoamerican culture like the Olmec, the Maya, the Zapotec, Aztec, or others commonly used gold as a medium on which to write. We know, of course, that they wrote on carved in stone, and they wrote on books, papyrus, and bark, and other things. So my suggestion here is that that this idea of writing in gold is something that was a Nephite type of thing. Imagine the Spanish lust for gold during the conquest. If they'd come across any records, they would certainly have either destroyed them or melted them down to something else. So Nephite records would either have been destroyed by the Nephite conquest or have been so well hidden that they were never found. Just imagine what Spanish conquerors would have done if they'd come across a cache of gold plates. So for me, it's interesting that the only accepted and known examples of ancient writing on precious metal plates come from the Old World and mainly from the Middle East era. My suggestion is that this practice originated in that part of the world and was not widely practiced in Mesoamerica outside of Nephite or Jaredite cultures. Any Mesoamerican examples are few and far between, and they date to a later time period. So the fact that the Nephites kept their most important writings on metal plates, to me, indicates a Semitic or an Old World scribal tradition, not a Mesoamerican one. If Nephi got his idea of plates from Laban's plates, then that would be something from Jerusalem. Keeping records on thin metal plates is not originally an ancient American practice. It's possible other cultures may have seen this and adopted it later, but it doesn't seem to have been widely utilized in this hemisphere. So, just to kind of sum up, it's obvious that these things aren't really directly related to the Book of Mormon, but they show that this type of idea did exist, and that the study of metallurgy in ancient America is still a wide open field, and there's a lot that we still don't know yet. And when we look at the Book of Mormon, we need to see, what does the Book of Mormon actually say, and what does it not say. That helps us, I think, to really correlate it much more closely with the accounts we have of archaeology and Mesoamerica. So this, I think, this scenario is an explanation for the lack of advanced metallurgy that we find among, say, the Olmec or the pre-classic Maya. But we also don't need to assume that the records kept on metal plates were commonplace for the Nephites or Jaredites either. That could have been only for their special records that they kept and handed down that became the Book of Mormon. They probably had many other records that Mormon used to compile that perhaps were not metal plates. But the metal plates with the appearance of gold that Mormon compiled and handed down to Moroni had a special purpose. And that, of course, was to be buried and saved for the last day. So just to end up here, I've got a quote from Diego de Landa from his works that says that it may be that this country holds a secret that up to the present has not been revealed or which the natives of today cannot tell. And I think that sums up a lot of our current knowledge of the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica, which means there's a huge amount left for us to study and to learn by scholarly consensus, by faith, by any means necessary. And I appreciate your time, and that's the end of my presentation.